I'm sure you're all very tired, but hopefully you're ready for one last kick at this can, and hopefully we'll have an interesting and excellent and thought-provoking discussion with our four panelists, who are each going to talk for about 5 minutes, giving their overall responses to what they've heard over the last couple of days. Then I might poke them with a couple of questions myself, using my prerogative divinely ordained as the panel's moderator. And then we'll turn it over to you, because I think we're all eager to hear as much from you in the audience as we are from the panelists and from each other about what your thoughts were about the conference and where you think things are going to go in the future. But before I get into that and let the panelists have at it, I want to say thank you again to the organizers. Thank you to Christian and Bartek, who worked extremely hard, who are the Deputy Director of the Center for Totalitarian Studies, to John Cornell, who has worked tirelessly, in particular to Alexandra and Urszula, who've worked even more tirelessly. They have really... And also, thank you to the interpreters who have worked extremely hard over the last couple of days, and we very much appreciate their efforts. Okay, I'm sure our panelists need, by this point, no introduction. You're familiar with them. Hopefully you've had a chance to talk to them over the last couple of days. You've got to know them. Their biographies are in the booklet. If you want to know them all over again, you can read them. But otherwise, let's hear from them, and we'll start with John McGill, if that's okay, of the University of Warsaw.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Dzień dobry. Sorry. When I received the invitation to attend the conference and make some remarks, I was a little befuddled because what are you going to tell people who are doing all the things that you're doing, reading the papers, the media, listening to what is going on in Europe, and to say something that is new? So what I did was I went to the library. That's a good place to start when you're going to a conference. And I looked up the library holdings in something called the Online Computer Library Center, which is usually called OCLC in the United States and in Europe. And it has a database called First Search, which allowed me to pick some of my own rather subjective categories to investigate who, or I should say how many, volumes in English were in US academic libraries. And what I found, I picked 2023 because I figured after the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, there would be a lot of interest in that topic. And so that would be a kind of a benchmark. We could see how many people have written books, not articles, but books on that topic. And then it was a question of doing those rather subjective categories. So most of the time in our field, we talked about Soviet and East European studies. My logic was that once you say Soviet, the East European side is something different. And so I picked three keywords: Russia, the USSR, and the Soviet Union. And for our purposes here, I'm just going to collapse all that other stuff, whether it's East Central Europe or Central and Eastern Europe or Eastern Europe and all of the countries therein, into one pile. And you can see all the numbers there. In order to place the 2023 numbers into context, I went backward in time and looked at essentially 10-year chunks. Now, I was looking for trends, not for rather specific moments in time. And if I had picked different years, maybe those numbers would be different. But I think the trend is obvious. And what did I find? I concluded that there was an 800-pound gorilla in the room. Those of us who, as in my case, concentrated on the countries west of the Soviet Union and Russia, and east of Germany and Italy, East Central Europe in my case, I found that there were more books in U.S. academic libraries on those countries than there were on the Soviet Union. I was a little bit taken aback. The reason was at one point for about 20 years, I was the director of the East European and Eurasian National Resource Center at Columbia. So every year I got $1.5 million for the library, for language stipends, and so on and so forth. And a lot of that was directed, particularly in the early years, at the Soviet Union, so Soviet studies specifically. On top of that, of course, there were, as Mark could probably say better than I could, private donors who, for one reason or another, decided that they wanted their name on an institute or a center at various institutions. Mark is well, the recipient of some of that largesse, and at Columbia, the Harriman Institute was also honored with that. Unfortunately, the Institute on East Central Europe was prevented from looking for funding by the university, which simply said, you cannot do any fundraising. We ignored that. However, more books were published on East Central Europe than on Russia / the Soviet Union. As you can see at the bottom with the subtotals, those are percentages, how much more of a number were East Central Europe as opposed to Soviet and Russian. Now, I couldn't figure something out. When I started with 2023, I figured that this was going to make a big impact in interest in Russia and, of course, Ukraine. And so I was a little bit dumbfounded when it didn't work out that way, when the numbers dropped. And I don't know if that's due to length of publication and preparation of manuscripts, or whether, in fact, scholars are not yet ready, for the most part, to do something serious on the war. Now, I'm very thankful to the Pilecki Institute, and having attended the gala last night, we saw that Christopher Miller received a special award for his book on the war. And I'm guessing that over time there will be more books like that. I know that Adrian Karatnitsky just published a book called Battleground Ukraine. But that happened in 2024, so it doesn't appear in the numbers that I looked at. In any case, we are all aware that before 1989, 1991, it was really not very likely that scholars in the Soviet bloc, taken as a whole, would have the freedom to research and publish books that were serious. Which means that there was a deficit in the languages of those countries, but not in English. And so I'm not surprised that the numbers for that early period are a bit higher for English language books. And then I'm also not surprised that in the 90s, those numbers start to drop. And I think the reason is that those scholars who got hired in the 60s and the 70s were retiring. And so their output dropped. And it's entirely possible, too, that because of decisions inside university administration where people were not replaced, so Soviet specialists or Russian specialists were not replaced. And the same thing happened, of course, for the East Central European countries. There was a drop there. So that output starts to be felt already in the 2000s and later. Having said that, and having been in Poland for a bunch of years, I am very happy that scholars in the countries of the region took advantage of the new situation and the fact that they no longer had to toe the line for Marxism, Leninism, and be told that your book will never be published. In Poland, there's a beautiful term for this called pułkowniki. Things went on the shelf and stayed there. Today, that's a relic of the past. And we saw that last night at the gala, too. So there is, I think, a massive output of publications that are in the works and already being published. And it's not just the academic forges, it's not just the universities. So most of you are familiar with IPN, with the Institute for Public Remembrance in Poland. That is a factory of book production. Not everything is of equal interest, but the trend is definitely there. The Pilecki Institute is doing quite a bit in terms of research. And then there are, of course, the museums. There's more museums now, not just in Poland, but in other countries also, that are putting real resources at the hands of scholars who now are picking topics that they could only dream about earlier. So what I see is a slight decline in English language books and an uptick, a very substantial uptick in the production of books on the region by scholars. And I wouldn't be a bit surprised, by the way, if some of those scholars at least started to do Russian studies. Why the heck not? Frankly, I would be very interested to see what materials are available to people who are interested in topics that fall in that keyword, Russian. But I'm sure that people are doing work like that as well. And of course, as time goes on, we'll probably see, as I said earlier, more books on the Russian-Ukrainian problem. So I am led to conclude that, at least in East Central European studies, the future is a bright one. There are also different points of view that we're coming to understand why populations of different countries react differently to the situation to the east. Here we are in Poland. Nobody here has to be told that Poles are very nervous about what's going on in Ukraine. So all of these things factor into my view that East Central European studies are doing well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Surprisingly optimistic, given the overall tone of some of the things we've heard over the last couple of days. Igor, would you like to fire away?
Okay, thank you. I have to say that we got 2 days ago, day ago, an email from Jan, and just he scheduled what we would be talking about, what he would like to hear from us. And your first issue you raised was any aspect of the conference that takes your fancy. And I think that we have been discussing within the last 3 days a lot of very important topics like economic and political integration of Ukraine with the EU, and yesterday especially, the last panel, prosecution of war crimes and redefinition of the war crimes in the light of the aggression, invasion of Russia against Ukraine. I'm a historian, so for me especially important was the discussion of the concept of Central and Eastern Europe. Also, should we put between these two adjectives conjunction, or rather a hyphen, so Central Eastern Europe. So to put it briefly, is the central, is there something like an entity going through the history which might be described as Central Eastern Europe. And we had a wonderful panel discussion which was moderated by Bartłomiej Krzysztof, with papers by Sławomir Łukaszewicz and Alexander Avramczuk. They were going back to the debate between Toynbee and Oskar Halecki. We were discussing also Halecki's concept of Central Europe. And I think that what was enriching for me was the confrontation of two concepts. On the one hand, the concept, Halecki's concept of the Third Europe, which was based on the Jagiellonian idea on the one hand, but also the legacy of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth not only of two nations, but many nations, at least four nations, as a matter of fact. And on the other hand, we have also touched upon another tradition, which is very characteristic for the intellectual debates on the definition of Central Europe, so the Austro-Hungarian of a legacy basing on the tradition of the Habsburg monarchy. And also, some speakers during the conference referred to Milan Kundera's concept of kidnapped Europe, which actually deals with both things. On the one hand, this is a part of this Austro-Hungarian legacy, and on the other hand, this is a reaction to the division of Europe after 1945. I think that for us, so from the Polish angle, it's so important to continue not only the debate, but to implement concept of the ULB, which was proposed by Kultura Paryska in the 1970s. So Giedroyć's and Mieroszewski's concept, which became a foundation for the Polish foreign policy after the change in 1989 and 1990. So Poland was the first state which recognized independence of Ukraine. This is the best proof for that. But in the light of the current situation, the current ongoing war in Ukraine, I think that we need to ask also a question about Germany. Germany in this constellation, ULB on the one hand, well, I'm saying B in the hope that there will be the process of democratization of Belarus in the nearest future. That I hope that it will happen. And on the other hand, well, ULB plus PL plus, well, DE, an acronym for Germany. What is so unique in this situation nowadays for me? So for me, it's important that, you know, the old concept of the Mitteleuropa. So Friedrich Naumann's concept from World War I is no more relevant. After February 2022, Germany were supposed or were forced by the political situation to change the fundament of its policy, which based on the presumption verhandeln durch Handel, negotiate by doing trade business with Russia. In my opinion, Poland is no more sandwiched between Germany and Russia. Germany has been changing the priorities of its foreign policy in the vein of the persistent engagement we heard about in the keynote by Professor Lucas on the first day of our conference. Well, this collapse of the import policy of the cheap energy from Russia, making Germany and other European countries dependent on Russia, is a very important factor nowadays in the constellation in Central Eastern Europe. Germany is rethinking its role in not only in the global context, but also in the regional context of the Central Eastern Europe. And perhaps the best proof for that are the plans of creating a German brigade in Lithuania. This is, for me, quite important signal coming from Germany. These plans are going back like 1 year ago. And this is about 5,000 German soldiers on the Lithuanian soil near the Lithuanian Belarus border. So I think that this old paradigm of Poland and other Central East European countries being situated somehow between Germany and Russia is no more relevant. That's why I would be glad to encourage the Polish government and the German government as well to pursue the policy in the vein of, more dialogic policy, not to continue the legacy of the last 5 or 7 years when the anti-German stereotypes were in a very populistic way incited by some politicians and some parties, especially here in Poland. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Then we.
Okay.
Mic is on.
This was arranged. Tatiana
Yes,
would go
we're not
last, so-
skipping Tatiana. We're
I'm
giving
not-
her a
I'm
chance
not-
to take a break because she
I'm
only
not
just
ignoring
went.
her.
So.
Okay, very good. Thank you. First of all, I too will join you in thanking the Pilecki Institute for organizing such a stimulating conference. I found it a very intellectually rich conference. I had expected more to be said about what is in the title of the whole conference, about the impact of the Russia-Ukraine war on East Central European studies. And there was some about that, but most of what was discussed at the conference was about either the impact of the Russian-Ukraine war on the politics of the region, or in general the impact it's had in global politics, and to some extent within Ukraine. But there wasn't as much said about it on its impact on East Central European studies. And so let me just, one thrust, though, that has come out from that and was discussed extensively at the conference was the notion of decolonization. And now it depends on how that word is used. This came up before, I think, in Tatiana's comments. But generally, I long before that notion became popular was in favor of studying parts of countries of East Central Europe. The first Slavic language I learned was Polish, not Russian, and the next Slavic language I learned was Ukrainian, not Russian, and then I learned others, but starting with Russian and Bulgarian and so forth. So so I also come from a family of Latvian Jewish emigres, and my father's family were deported to the Gulag in 1941. So I was acutely aware of that Moscow wasn't the Soviet Union. It was certainly an important part of it, but the Soviet Union to be understood, and it's why I didn't call the Soviet Union Russia. I called it Soviet Union and still do, because there were other parts of it that should be emphasized. And so in that sense, I welcome decolonization. In fact, started going to the Ukrainian archives in 1993 and did research there and published a short monograph based on that research, and I think it was in 1999 or thereabouts. So I am strongly in favor of decolonization. I do think, though, especially in the early stages. This wasn't at the conference. This was more, I think, in some of the online discussion about what decolonization should entail, and if it meant the rejection of everything Russian, including Russian literature of the 19th century, so we should no longer study the poetry of Pushkin or Lermontov or the novels of Dostoevsky or others. I find that sort of anti-intellectual and silly, and I refuse to accept it. I hope people are studying that literature till the end of time because it deserves it. And similarly, there at other times I think where there is sometimes a reluctance to acknowledge because of Putin's poisonous fantasies about history and the notion that Ukrainians are just Russians and shouldn't have their own state. But there are commonalities between Russians and Ukrainians that, and some of these were discussed here at the conference. But still, to overlook those commonalities, I think, would be just as foolish as to take Putin's view of history. And even as late as, say, 1999, when NATO went to war in Kosovo, both Ukraine and Russia opposed it. And so if you look at public opinion polls from, say, 1999 through the early 2000s, really until 2004, when Russia's intervention in the Orange Revolution began to change things quite significantly. But that there was actually a majority in Ukraine who favored stronger bonds with Russia. And in fact, I think it was 54% supported union with Russia of the sort that was going on with Belarus. Fortunately, that sentiment changed, but still, I think to deny it would be to distort history. And so in pushing for decolonization, I hope that it will not lead to a stylized version of history, and in fact will acknowledge some of the commonalities. Even as greater emphasis, and I have to admit, I too was surprised by these figures, John, and welcome them. But I mean, Bulgaria is a little weak, but still, my wife is originally from Bulgaria, and so I spend a fair amount of time there because we own an apartment in Sofia, and am always acutely aware that it is largely ignored, even though it's now a member of NATO and the EU and the Schengen area. But I know in Sheptytsky's talk yesterday, he talked about how the Balkans aren't really the Balkans anymore. That, as someone who spends a lot of time in Bulgaria, I can't agree with that. But certainly not the way people who live there view it. But still, there are very encouraging trends going on now as a result of this war. But just as the impact of the U.S. war in Vietnam had some healthy impact on scholarship, but also some very negative impact on it. And the same with the U.S. war in Iraq, again, a colossal blunder. But it had a healthy impact on scholarship, but also had in many cases, a grossly distorting one. And so this war can have and has had a healthy impact on scholarship. I just hope, though, the distorting aspects of it will fade away, and so that people won't feel uncomfortable about studying the poetry of Pushkin or Lermontov or reading the novels of Dostoevsky. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Mark. So I'll pass it back to Tatiana then.
Yeah, some final remarks about possible future perspective of East Central Europe studies. Though, from my experience, nowadays more and more scholars, they in general also, revision is our everything. More and more scholars start to question the very existence of this term, maybe showing it as a kind of product of Cold War. So now every country has its own way and own peculiarity. Why we unite them all under any unifying geographical category? As a lecturer in Ukraine and also abroad, I read a lot of texts in search of question how to explain to our students why is it important actually to study East and Central Europe, why it can be useful for them. And despite reading plenty of new texts, I haven't found any better formula than which was proposed by Piotr Vandic quite long ago in 80s in his well-known book Price of Freedom. But paradoxically enough, he started the book at the first page, not from the stating that unfortunately Central Eastern European history is quite often uninteresting, but it's important to study it. And how he defined why it can be uninterested. It's neither exotic enough to arouse curiosity, especially in the West, nor sufficiently familiar to facilitate understanding, real understanding of this region. So if we look at the majority of books which are produced in the field of culture and history of the region, we can see an attempt to feed these tendencies. So either it's attempt to play or even exaggerate this exotism, putting these images of playground, of powerful neighbors, horrible, unlucky territorial position, nations and communities born in violence and blood and who suffered every generation a horrible experience. So guys, open the books. So I already use this way, you can understand what the book's about even looking at its cover. How the majority of books on East Central Europe look like black, red colors, some pictures showing either really horrible scenes or give some feeling of that extra space of violence and bloodshed is here. And the majority of books which get high price are usually devoted to the darkest pages of East Central European history. Ukrainian history is not an exception. So it's one of the possible strategies till now actively used, and it hasn't come to an end. And another one, we see more and more voices, and I had this voice from the left, so let us step away from this image of horrible territories in between, all these bloodlands metaphors. And then another option proposed by Vandic comes out. Make this region familiar and understandable. Talk about general tendencies, migration, economical changes, youth subcultures, something which resonates with the experience from readers from outside, and also make this region interesting. Actually, I have noted that for young readers and young students, this second approach works for the best. For example, books they love most of all are not about Holocaust or kidnapping or mass terror, but about popular punk culture. For example, in Poland, the texts are always taken with great interest. So either exotization or normalization. Between these two options, till now the field is struggling, and everybody can choose its way. And the conference is extremely valuable that we had a chance to unite people with different approaches, different topics, and maybe the key outcome is not to find the final answer, but to see all the possible perspectives.
Can I ask a question before you chip in?
I just want very quickly to say, a publisher that I once was speaking with, when asked what are the books that sell best, and he said, dogs, baseball, and the Kennedys.
I would add football to that list. I want to follow up on Tatiana's point a little bit, to think, and maybe reflecting on what you were saying, Mark, as well, at the beginning of your remarks. How do you think, based on what you've heard over the last couple of 3 days, and what you've seen over the last couple of years, how do you think we can take the methods, the formulas, the theories that are being developed within Central and Eastern Europe, or whatever you're going to call it, and by Central and Eastern European peoples, in particular in light of the last couple of years, how can we take those into the, and I hate this phrase, forgive me, into the global marketplace of ideas. How can we take them so that these ideas are not being judged by and through the Western lens, but are being valued for what they are, right? So that we're not kind of going begging to American universities and saying, please publish our little ideas about our little countries that are too exotic or too unfamiliar. Is there something you've seen in the last couple of days or the last couple of years that really strikes you, whether it's a big idea or if you want to name specific talks or specific scholars, specific areas?
Very quickly. One thing that, I edited a journal at Harvard, and I'm pleased to say that there are numerous people here who have published articles, and it's a journal that comes out quarterly from MIT Press, and it's about to complete its 26th year. And there are numerous people here who have contributed to it. Others, like Anton, who have had their books reviewed in it. So it's not to say that we want to take on that function, but it's instead designed to support these scholars, because if they publish in peer-reviewed Q1 journals, then it helps them with their universities or their institutes, because there are scales in many EU countries now by which promotions are driven by that. So it's one way. I would have pursued it regardless of that, but it definitely has helped people. I also, from the beginning, have established close ties with archivists in various countries, including, in the case of Ukraine, with Andriy Kahut, the head of the former Ukrainian KGB archive, who has done an excellent job there. He's still, even now, working in the archive during the war. And I had him at a conference in Italy a few months ago. And he came and, again, gave a fantastic talk about how the war had affected his work. And the same is true in other countries of Central and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. So those are among the ways that I think scholars in the West can contribute.
Actually, for me, it's a complicated question, but if I take a Ukrainian example and following this second possible strategy, a good book in Ukrainian was reading by Katerina Dysa. In English, it would be A History with Witches, the history of witchcraft and witch hunting in Ukraine. So it's an interesting example when a recognizable and attractive, this horrifying, attractive, all European topics is brilliantly uncovered on local material, but it's not strictly stressing like Ukrainian or any other national connotation. It seems to me it's one of the good examples how original can work for both for curiosity of readers and for uncovery of the region. And it seems to me that one of the key problems, a good thing to talk about in Central Europe, is not to focus on 20th century. Middle Ages and early modern times are extremely rich and extremely unstudied period, which give us a lot of chances for these actually multicultural and entangled approaches we talk so much about, but not always incorporate on contemporary materials, partly because of political reasons.
I want to give you a hug, especially for your last comment, since I'm not, my research is based actually on the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries. I was just listening to you about some tendency we have in a debate between the Polish and Ukrainian historians, but also some Belarusians and Lithuanian, on the phenomenon of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which, as I said already before, was not only the Polish-Lithuanian, but was the Commonwealth of many nations. And what is so interesting, within the last 2 years, I'm trying to follow the emergence of new notion, which is Rzeczpospolitanin in Polish. I apologize in advance to our translators. So Rich Pospolitanin in Ukrainian, which might be perhaps translated into English as Republican citizen. Or Republican citizen. Please, no associations with the Republican Party in the US. And this is a quite new notion, which was inspired by Natalia Yakovenko, doyen of the Ukrainian historiography already in the 90s and at the beginning of 2000. And why it's been so attractive for Polish, Lithuanian, and to some extent also Belarusian historians, because this is an attempt to describe the pre-modern history using categories which would enable us to share the legacy, the common legacy of this strange space called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So I think first that we need to coin new notions to describe not only the history of the long 19th century or the history of the 20th century, but also to pay more attention to the pre-modern history. And what is important in relation to the history of the 20th century and especially the current situation. Well, we had a wonderful debate with the paper given by Hannah, well, on, again, imperialism. And I just wonder, how can we describe Putin's authoritarianism, Putin's Russia, Putin's regime? Should we just stick only to the terms which have been used in the 20th century, at the beginning of the 21st century, you know, classical categories of the imperialism, colonialism, and so on? Or should we find new notions? And one of those, which intellectually for me is quite interesting, is the notion of Russism. And I'm referring here to the book by Władysława Jakubova, who is a Ukrainian scholar, trying to describe and characterize Putin's, Russia's political system in a new way using new notions. We can agree with her opinion, with her concept, we can discard it. Nonetheless, this is something which might be interesting on the public debate in Europe and perhaps in the United States.
Maybe just a side observation. One of the reasons why books aren't published by either international publishers, like, and here you can pick your poison, whichever of them you prefer, or American or Canadian publishers, is because they know they're not going to make any money on a lot of this stuff. So it's great if somebody wants to do a book with photographs or illustrations of Wycinanki, or pick your poison here, any other folklore or folkloric topic. But if a publisher decides that I'm not going to make my money back on this book, then they're not going to publish it. So these are good ideas, but they're impractical because there's not a market for it. And that's one of the reasons why in the United States, even relatively well-known poets resort to self-publication, which means they invest their own money in producing 200 or 100 copies of a book, and then pushing it privately to different universities if our university is interested in that stuff. It's debilitating, it's demoralizing, because people very often begin to withdraw. They understand that market forces are working against them. Now, maybe there's a way to do this that hasn't worked so far, but could work in the future. There are cultural institutes in different cities, both in Europe and in the United States. In this research here, I mentioned OCLC. That's an NGO. There are member organizations, so universities are members, and they send money to this group, which they find to be very useful. So why is it not possible for the Ukrainian Institute in New York City, the Taras Shevchenko Society in New York City, the Ukrainian Academy in New York City, the Kościuszko Foundation, the Polish Institute of Arts and Sciences, the Czechoslovak, if they're still called that. There is an organization like that. I just can't remember the exact name. But bringing those people together at a conference and saying, look, why don't we throw some money in the pot and see what comes out of this? And something that would, by design, be used for instruction either at the high school level or at the college level, and something that would be entirely new, because nothing like that exists. So there might be ways of doing this, but then you'd have to have somebody to be the motor of this, somebody to propose such a meeting. It can be done, because I know that there are archival meetings like that are held in different places in Europe. So people do exchange ideas. I think ultimately we're not talking about a lot of money. It doesn't cost that much money to publish a book. If you're not first of all interested in the return in terms of money, but in terms of the effect it has on different populations, why wouldn't somebody in tertiary education be interested in how different populations use illustrations for their own purposes? It would be a really good idea, I think. You just need to have somebody as the center of gravity for that idea, and I think that's an issue that you will have to solve, Tatiana.
I'm just going to make one.
If it would be an issue, I'm sorry, one introduction. Maybe the first thing we need to focus on is the publication of sources connected with the region in English and German, first of all. Because if you mention Pushkin, okay, let us read him, but let us start with Клеветникам России. So it's impossible to connect a very diverse source base published online access. It's even better if you don't spend money if you don't need to force somebody to donate for us. But it must be a diverse and a kind of post-colonial oriented source base for East Central Europe studies. And then everybody can choose the text and interpret them according to their preferences. No pressure, but a wide proposal.
Igor, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I want to react, and I want to strike a deal with you, because I'm just holding in my hand something which would be wonderful if it's translated into English. And these are the result of the Polish-Ukrainian Roundtable, which was held last year in Munich at the Ukrainian Free University. And the session was organized by Maria Pryslak. And actually, it dealt with the problems raised already by Tatiana. How to apply the colonial paradigm for the Polish-Ukrainian relations. Unfortunately, we didn't have enough funds to translate it into English, so this publication I cordially recommend you was published only in Polish and Ukrainian and is available online.
Perfect, thank you. I just want to make one observation before we take this to the audience. It's very interesting that we began the conference by talking about geography and about the space where we are between great powers. And yet now what we're talking about is markets and commerce. And it makes me wonder, in a very bleak way, is academia the place to be publishing this stuff? Is the academic book the right place to be doing any of this stuff? You can publish 18,954 books about a topic, but if no one reads them, and man, we probably write some good books in this room, but let's be honest, not many people are reading them. Is that the place where we're going to push these ideas forward? Okay, Igor, we'll have your response and then we'll go to the audience.
Well, one of the panels was on the history education. And, you know, I'm based in Germany, that's why I'm coming back to the idea, to the concept of the joint German-Polish textbook for history, which was published between, 4 volumes, published between 2016 and 2020. And in my eyes, this project turned out to be a success. We have many requests from other regions of Europe. We are invited to the conferences, and we are supporting some projects, for example, in the Balkans, of history textbooks. And, you know, there's a new phenomenon in the educational culture at the beginning of the 20th century, which is called transnational or bilateral or trilateral or multilateral textbooks for history. And I was just yesterday presenting a view how some solutions we applied in our joint Polish-German textbook might be applied, and this is my dream, for a possible Polish-Ukrainian textbook for history. I think that especially now, during the ongoing war in Ukraine, we should start working on such a textbook, a Polish-Ukrainian textbook for history, and we should not limit it only to the 20th century, because most of the transnational education materials for history are limited to the 20th century, but we need to go back into the Middle Ages, into the early modern era, and we should, of course, present the long 19th century and the short 20th century as well, until now. So I'm an advocate, an ardent advocate of such a project of the joint Polish-Ukrainian textbook for history with beautiful illustrations, of course, which would be available not only in the Polish and Ukrainian language versions, but also in English one. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Igor. That's a beautiful dream to end on. Very transnational, very post-colonial, collapsing boundaries and geographies.
But also based on some Polish-German experiences. And I'd like to stress once again, because, you know, the map on the cover of our conference programs shows Germany and Austria as well. And I was a bit missing in our debates these 2 countries and the possible contribution of these 2 countries to our Central Eastern dialogue. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. Who's going to help me take the questions from the Pilecki gang? Christian is, and I'm very keen. I know we still have a handful of PhD students and postdocs, recent graduates, junior scholars in the room. I'm very keen to give the first question or 2 to any PhD students in the room. No. So if you want to ask, we can take you afterwards, but if you want to have the chance to go first, you are the future of Central Eastern Europe, so... No? All right, then we'll pretend you're still doing your PhD.
So, let's say that Professor Sławomir is a student. He's always a student. We are always students.
University of life, right?
Yeah? The whole life.
I can start with my students' years. So first of all, thank you very much for this very rich panel, I think. And starting with Piotr Wandysz, which you mentioned, and let's say showing this line from Oskar Halecki, who was his master, let's say, in defining East Central Europe. And it is not only geographical concept, it's more cultural one. Yes, what we discussed during this panel, which Professor Konkolewski mentioned. and which can be, let's say, we can give the line to what is Central Europe and Colombia. We can tell a few words about, I don't know, Adam Ulam from Harvard, who's writing about East Central Europe as a laboratory of neo-imperialism. I will talk about this next week. Just invitation for conference on Prometheism. So many such things I have in my hand. But why we are talking about this, and it was also the topic of our panel, we were talking about epistemic violence. Epistemic violence or epistemic justice, or something what can be called engaged historiography. In this sense, that historiography has sense if we want to achieve something through our writings. Not only, let's say, to write, okay, sometimes about very exotic topics, but simply to change the world a little bit by what we are writing. And epistemic violence is against this. Yes, it's against this discussion when we are trying to get something as a subject of the whole thing, like, I don't know, Ukraine, East Central Europe, all the countries, because this discourse on decolonization, which is ongoing globally, I think, means simply that we cannot focus on, let's say, Soviet Union, USSR, Russia, and so on, but we have to add more and more to other former republics, nations, ethnic groups, interconnections between them, and so on and so forth. It is extremely difficult task because we need language proficiency, we need many things we simply do not have. So once again, thank you so much for this panel, and this is rather the comment, however, if you want to comment on this.
Yeah, would anyone like to respond?
Thank you so much. I just wanted to add that thank you for mentioning your conference, because next week is another conference about imperialism, colonialism, the Promethean conference at Warsaw University. Our partners, there will be another one, big interesting conference, so please check the webpage of Warsaw University and attend this conference if you will be here. So Ian, sorry for interrupting you.
No, that's quite okay. Sell the conferences. We're very busy over here. Yeah, would anyone like to chip in with a thought on that? No. Yeah, exactly. It was a beautiful comment and well made. Thank you. Does anyone else have a question or comment, thoughts, reflections, hopes, dreams? All right. Then I have a. Okay, you go.
One thing with regard to the question of publishing is Central European University Press has, I think, done quite a good job of covering, of publishing books that might not have gotten published by other publishers, not because of quality of the books, but simply for the reasons that I think John mentioned. And so there are other outlets. I mean, the cost of translation that's a big one, and it's a big obstacle, I should mention. So there, I think, there have been on occasion these NGOs that have contributed funding for translation costs, but that there, I think, if efforts to think through how that can be done more efficiently might be good.
Also, if you're looking for good publishers, Academic Studies Press out of Boston, is it?
It's Boston.
Yeah, they have great stuff, and they are publishing on these, these exact topics. They will take your inquiries.
The only thing I should add, though, they don't cover the cost of translation. So.
Yeah, sorry. Any other questions? Otherwise, I'm just going to take the floor and ask all the questions I want.
Maybe the last one, if I may. I mean, because on our session before, we were trying to ask a question. I mean, we had four papers, so it was impossible to have a discussion. So maybe right now we would ask a question which was stated by Dr. Olga Gontarska. Is it really, will be there a real change in the studies of our region because of the war? Or you think there will be not? I mean, if it doesn't make any difference, to be honest, because we had these eruptions in the history, like Polish history was quite popular in the 80s because of Solidarity movement, yes, with many political visits and stuff like that. And it's always like when the time passes, new problem arises and the focus is shifting somewhere else. So the question is if it will influence the studies in a long-term perspective, like in 10, 20 years, or maybe it's a wrong question. Maybe it already has changed because, as John Mitzgill has shown us, actually what Tatiana said, it's a little bit wrong, yeah? Because what Professor Mitzgill is showing us, it's already happening, yeah? It's already happening that we don't have so much publications about Russia, and we just living in this myth that the Russia is still in focus on Western universities. Maybe it's not the case. I'm saying it's provocatively just to stimulate the discussion. So Ian, then you can ask your questions. Thank you so much.
Since you're being provocative, we can be provocative too. Some of you, maybe all of you, who knows, remember the old anecdote about how many Poles were in France after 1830 and the failure of the uprising in 1831. And the French were at wit's end trying to handle all these Poles who were talking about how they were going to free Poland from the Russians and everybody else. And the scholars in Paris decided, well, we've got to pick a topic that they won't be able to talk about independence. So they decided that they would put out a call for papers about the elephant. Some of you may remember this anecdote. And the Italians came up with, the elephant and his diet. And the French came up with the elephant and his love life. The Germans came up with the elephant and his anatomy. And a Polish guy came up with the elephant and the Polish question. So we can talk about all kinds of possibilities, and of course there's nothing wrong with that. But I think you have to be a little bit realistic about how you go about achieving your goal. And some of the things that come out of a conference like this may wind up happening in a different way. And it may even be something that some of us will get involved in, who knows. But that's the nature of a conference also. So some ideas work, some ideas don't work.
Very quick. I do want to come back to what Slavoj said, but first, I had heard a version of that joke, John, but I think with the Germans it was a 20-volume introduction to a study of the elephant or something like that. But with regard to Slavic is, I very much share, that is, I know you're working on a study of Polish emigre Sovietologists, and that I welcome that you're doing that, and I hope people will continue to study Soviet history without feeling guilty about it. So that's where it shouldn't become a cudgel to whack people over the head depending on what they're studying. And even as I think with regard to the question about the impact on the region, there's no question in the short term it is, that is during the war, it has greatly increased attention to the region, especially Ukraine, but also more generally the whole region that's the theme of this conference. And whether that will outlast the war is hard to say. I hope so. I do remember, I started as assistant professor at Harvard during the late Gorbachev period. And at that time, I was drawing classes with, 150 students or so. And in the early 90s, it consistently fell off. I mean, maybe it was my teaching, but I don't think so. I mean, the number of people enrolled in learning Russian, sharply declined, plummeted, and other Slavic languages. So it, I hope it will outlast the war, and that's why I think it's important to take steps to ensure that it did. I mean, John's Institute at Columbia played an important role in ensuring that there continued to be attention to Poland after the Solidarność crisis, and so there are ways of trying to foster that interest and keep it going, and I hope that will be done with Ukrainian studies too.
Yeah, I think it's working. Okay. Going back to, well, the issue raised by John, publications and translations of the Polish acknowledged authors who published their books also on some very controversial issues in the Polish-Ukrainian relations in the past, especially in the 20th century. So this is one example what might be done and what should be done. The acknowledged book by Grzegorz Motyka, from the Volhynian massacre to Operation Vistula, so to very important realms of memory for Poles, but also for the Ukrainians. And for me, this is something very telling. So this book was first translated into Russian, then into Ukrainian, and with a huge delay only into English. I think that just discussing such very hot topics, also for the culture of memory, so current culture of memory, might be attractive for the audience abroad, also provided it's been translated, of course, into the lingua franca, which is English nowadays. And because we are trying to find other new topics of research, so I think that Jewish studies, combining Jewish studies with Central East European studies might be very productive if we could be able to narrow a bit of our perspective from the macro-regional, so let's say Central East of Europe, to more narrower perspective, so micro-regions. Borderlands. Borderlands, this is especially interesting phenomenon in the history of Central Eastern Europe. Of course, borderlands are everywhere across the world. Nonetheless, here, specifically in the 19th and 20th century history, when we have a phenomenon of the delayed statehood forming, the borderlands perceived as the laboratories of multiculturalism. Specific multiculturalism for this part of Europe might be perhaps interesting for the audience abroad if we specifically focus, try to combine the Jewish studies with the studies of our, let's call them minorities, ethnic groups living on this borderland territories. And I have a wonderful book with me. So John brought statistics, I brought books, which is only available in German, unfortunately, written by Marcin Wiat, who is sitting just behind the author by Marcin Wiat. And this is literally a guidebook on Galicia. My dream, because I'm a dreamer, would be to translate this book into English, just to present the richness of such regions as Galicia, on the one hand, but on the other hand, Upper Silesia. So when I'm talking about borderland studies, let's call it in this way, I'm not only limiting my focus on, well, one specific borderland region. I would dream about more comparative studies on the Central East European borderlands. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any more comments or questions from the audience? Oh, Tatiana.
Maybe still one final comment upon the most important question, actually, we should discuss whether they were influenced or not, the study of the region. For me, it's very difficult to say for the colleagues from other countries. Of course, for Ukrainian scholars, I would say for my generation and maybe for the next generations, for those who are children now, old pro-Soviet and pro-Russian imperial narratives are dead forever. So for this generation, it would be like, I can't imagine that somebody is going to read a book about Russian Revolution, 1970, which was widespread like just 5 years ago, and it was absolutely okay. So, of course, for Ukrainian historiography and broad Ukrainian studies, this war is a forever turning point in many topics. Whether outside academias of neighboring countries and far neighbors will be absolutely open and empathetic to these changes, it's a big question. So I would say in this way.
Is that your mention of the Motika book reminded me. I wrote a review of a Polish edition in Slavic Review at the time it came out, and similarly in the journal that I edit, we frequently publish reviews of books in foreign languages, and part of it is designed to bring people's attention to them because they generally won't know about them unless there are reviews in English.
Any further thoughts from the audience? Speak now or forever hold thy peace. No objections? Anton, objection. Go ahead.
No, just a brief comment in terms of tension, what publishers want to publish and what the people in the region would like to read or what they consider important. Like years ago, I was at a conference in Paris, and that took place shortly after Tim Snyder's Bloodlands book came out. So their organizers evoked the notion of Bloodlands, and then one of their participants from the region, he was visibly upset, said, "I reject the notion. I don't want to think that I live in Bloodlands." And at the same time, I just observed how much it changed in terms of what publishers want to publish. Raphael Lemkin, honorable Polish son, when he was shopping for his book, Global History of Genocide, 1954-56, and he approached different presses one by one, and was told, it won't sell, really. So you see how much it changed, really.
Well, will it sell? I guess we'll find out in due course. We don't have the answer, but I want to thank all of our panelists. And I want to thank all of you as well. I've had a fabulous couple of days. I've been to all sorts of stuff that I didn't know anything about, from legal studies to big media studies and mathematics. It's been extremely instructive, and I'm very glad that we were here. So please go and join us for lunch and enjoy it, and we'll see you soon.